She's Not Lonely Part 1. My name is Gwen Marsh. I am 52 years old. I teach American literature at Columbus State University, and for 24 years I was married to a man who was very good at being seen. I want to start at the end. 7:04 in the morning, and I was standing in the middle of my office without any particular reason to be standing there. I had set my bag down. I had not opened my laptop. Outside the window, the campus was still mostly dark, the grass wet from the night before, catching the yellow of the path lights in a way that made the ground look like it was holding something it couldn't say. Someone had left a stack of Mark's campaign flyers on the bench by the walkway. Marsh for Council Building, Columbus, together. His face professionally lit, professionally confident, taking up the left third of the page. I had 12 hours until the Whitmore Gala. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a student essay I had kept for a year and a half without understanding why. Deja Campbell, spring semester, 2 years ago. I had written A+ at the top in red pencil and underlined a single sentence near the end. The women in these stories always know before they know. I read it once, set it down on the desk, looked at the flyers through the window. Then I picked up my bag and walked out. 12 hours. 22 days earlier on a Tuesday morning, I was making coffee and not asking any questions. That was the routine. Mark ate breakfast at the island with his laptop open, the screen angled just far enough that I would have had to come around to see it. I didn't come around. I poured my coffee and stood at the window over the sink and watched a neighbor back his truck out of the driveway, which was not interesting, but it was something to look at that was not Mark. The laptop screen read M for CQ1 projections. The header was visible from where I stood. Marsh for Council. A month before that, I had found a check made out to Marsh for Council preliminary expenses. $4,200 signed in Mark's handwriting, drawn on the account that both our names were on. He had not mentioned it. I had held the check for a few seconds and then filed it. Not in a folder, just in the back part of my mind where I put things I wasn't ready to look at yet. "Is Robin coming Friday?" Mark said. He was still looking at the laptop. "She hasn't confirmed." "Can you follow up? I need to know how many seats." Not "can you ask her?" Not "do you think she'll come?" "Can you follow up?" I need to know. The way you'd speak to a coordinator. I had been his coordinator for a long time and had not had a word for it until around year 15. I said I would follow up. He closed the laptop, picked up his keys, and left. The door didn't slam. It never slammed. He was too careful for that. I stood there in the kitchen for a while after the sound of his car faded. My coffee went a little cold. I drank it anyway. The texts came out 3 days later. I wasn't looking for them. I want to be clear about that because I have gone over this many times, the particular shape of how it happened, and I was not looking. Mark had left his phone on the coffee table when he went to get another glass of wine, and the screen lit up with a preview, the way phones do, when someone sends a message, the first line, just sitting there for anyone nearby to read. "Robin, don't worry about tonight. She has no idea." The wine was still being poured in the kitchen. I could hear it. I picked up the phone. I looked at the full chain. The messages were not long, but they were enough. They had the specific economy of people who had been communicating like this for a while, the shorthand of two people who did not need to explain their references. Mark came back in. He stopped when he saw me holding it. "Hey, she has no idea." I turned the phone toward him. What idea? He set the wine glass down. And then I watched him make the same shift I had seen him make 100 times with contractors, with city planners, with anyone who came at him sideways. The easy pivot from caught to managing. He was very good at it. Robin's having a hard time with Phil. She needed someone to talk to. I've just been on Tuesday nights, Gwen and Wednesday, and last Thursday. You're overreacting. She's lonely. You don't want me to have friends lonely. That word. I sat with it for a second. He was looking at me the way he always did when he expected me to back down. Patient, slightly pained, already prepared for the apology he assumed was coming. 24 years had given him very good data on this. The thing was, I had Robin's husband's number in my phone. I had never used it for anything. Phil Shane, CPA, met at a dinner party in 2019. Polite, quiet. The kind of man you file under Robin's husband and never think about directly. His number was there because Robin had texted it to me once. In case you need to reach Phil about the reservation. I opened the app, created a new group, added Robin, added Phil Shane, typed hi. I'm Gwen. I think we should talk. Sent it. The 3 dots that means someone is looking appeared immediately under Mark's name. Then they stopped. Then Robin's. Then both at once. The room was very quiet. Mark still had his wine glass. He was staring at his phone with an expression I had not seen before on him, and I had seen most of his expressions by then. 30 seconds. Maybe 40. Phil Shane joined the group. Then Phil typed, Robin, I filed last Tuesday. Gwen, thanks for the invite. A second message 9 seconds later, Mark. Congratulations on the campaign. Should be an interesting race. Mark looked up at me. Not the managed version. The actual version underneath. I only saw it for a moment before the management came back, but it was there. He had made a calculation, and somewhere in that calculation, I had not been assigned the correct value. Robin didn't reply. The word read appeared under Phil's message. She had read every word of it. She just had nothing to say. I took my keys and walked out. Not dramatically. I didn't have a speech prepared. I simply could not be inside that house for one more minute in the kitchen, where I had drunk cold coffee that morning and filed things in the back of my mind, so I picked up my bag and left. I sat in the car in the driveway for a long moment. The neighborhood was completely normal out there, someone's porch light on a dog barking one street over ordinary Tuesday night sounds. None of it had any relationship to what was happening inside my chest. I called Phil. He picked up on the second ring. I'm sorry, I said, because I didn't know how else to start. For what? For I don't know. For whatever this is. You didn't do this. No hesitation. Just a flat statement of fact, the way you'd correct a math error. I've had a file since November. A file. I started keeping records. I wasn't sure of anything specific. I knew there was a pattern. A pause. I didn't know about Mark. I knew about a pattern. I looked through the windshield at the street. One of Mark's campaign signs was staked into the grass 3 houses down, picked up the light from the street lamp. He had started putting them up last month. I had thought it was premature. I had said so. He had said, visibility is everything at this stage, Gwen, in the tone he used for things he'd already decided. Why didn't you tell me? I said. I didn't know if you'd want to know. He said it carefully, like it was something he'd thought about. Now I know. That was true. He did know now. You filed already, I said. That means you're done. You decided. Yes, I haven't. I know. Another pause. When you do call me, I have something you'll need to see. The dog was still barking somewhere down the block. The porch light across the street clicked off on a timer. I sat there after Phil hung up and let the ordinary neighborhood sounds just be what they were for a minute. I had filed things in the back of my mind for a long time. I had not understood until Phil Shane's flat accountant's voice said it plainly that filing was a decision too. Every time I filed something, I was choosing to leave it there. 24 years. I sat in the car a while longer. Then I drove to the 24-hour Kroger on Manchester and bought a box of orange Pecco tea and a container of soup I didn't need because I needed to be somewhere with fluorescent lights and strangers for a little while. On the way back, I passed another one of Mark's signs, Marsh for Council Building, Columbus Together. I turned onto our street, parked in front of the house, sat there. The women in these stories always know before they know. I had given that essay an A+ and moved on. I was done, moving on. Della Oakes has been the chair of the English department at Columbus State for 11 years. In that time, she has survived 2 deans, 1 accreditation review, and a divorce from a man who, according to Della, decided at 51 that his authentic self needed to live in Sedona. She doesn't talk about it much. She doesn't talk about most things much. That's what I've always appreciated about her. I knocked on her door at 8 to 10 on Thursday morning, 2 days after the group chat. Earlier than I'd ever shown up without a reason. She looked at me, took in whatever was on my face, stepped back and let me in without saying anything, then closed the door behind us. Her office smells like old paperbacks and the particular cold of a room whose window has been cracked open all winter. Stack of composition essays on the left side of her desk, a coffee mug on the right that had been empty long enough to stop steaming. She sat down, folded her hands, and waited. "How long have you known?" she said. "Known specifically 3 days. Suspected," I stopped. "Longer than I want to say." "What do you want?" "I want him to not be able to pretend this didn't happen." She looked at me steadily. "That's what you want? What do you need?" I didn't have an answer ready. I looked at her bookshelves, the ones I'd stood in front of 100 times during department meetings, all the same books I'd read and taught and assigned to undergraduates for 2 decades. I had spent a long time being very good at explaining what other people needed in fiction. I was considerably worse at it in my own life. "I don't know yet," I said, "but I need to start somewhere." Della picked up her phone and called someone without explaining who. 4 rings. Then, "Patricia, it's Della Oakes. I have a colleague who needs a consultation. Family law? Yes, today if possible." She listened. "Good." She hung up and wrote a name and address on a notepad and slid it across the desk. Patricia Drummond. An address on 2nd Avenue, 2 blocks from the courthouse. "She knows Georgia law," Della said. "Every clause." I folded the paper and put it in my coat pocket. We sat for a moment in the sound of students passing in the hallway outside, backpacks and sneakers, and someone's phone playing something with a heavy beat. All of it completely ordinary. "I should have said something years ago," Della said. "When I saw you making yourself smaller at faculty dinners so he could take up more room, I probably wouldn't have listened." "No," she said. "Probably not." She picked up the empty coffee mug and then set it back down. "Go see Patricia." I went. Mark was at a dinner with donors that night and the next night and the night after that. He was always somewhere. I had spent 24 years accepting the geography of his absence without asking for maps. I sat down at the desk in what he called his home office, which was also partly my home office, and I opened the online banking portal we had shared for nearly 2 decades. I pulled up 18 months of statements on the joint account. I was not an accountant, but I had spent 30 years teaching people to read carefully, to look for what a text did not say as much as what it said, to notice where the argument went quiet. The statements were not quiet. $67,000 over 14 months. Not in large amounts that might have flagged something in my mind. In amounts between $400 and $3,200, spread across categories that sounded reasonable in isolation. Client entertainment campaign, preliminary expenses, site visits, mileage reimbursements. There were 3 entries for something described as professional development Savannah on dates I now recognized as dates Mark had told me he was elsewhere. Robin had clients in Savannah. I sat there for a while with that number, 67,000. I thought about the fellowship I had not taken in 2001, the one at UNC that would have paid a stipend and a housing allowance and given me access to an archive I had wanted to work in since graduate school. Mark had just signed his first significant contract. "Columbus," he said. Columbus made sense. I had agreed. I had believed at 28 that a marriage was made of these kinds of agreements, that this was what it looked like to build something with someone. He had not asked about the fellowship since. I had stopped mentioning it around year 3. I copied the statements to a USB drive. I did not leave the drive in the house. I took it to my office the next morning and put it in the bottom drawer of my desk at school, under a folder of syllabi from courses I no longer taught. Robin called on the 9th day. I was in my car in the parking structure off Veterans Parkway, just sitting, not ready to drive anywhere yet. Her name came up on the screen, and I looked at it for long enough that I almost let it go to voicemail. Then I answered. But first, I opened the voice memo app and hit record. In Georgia, one party to a conversation is enough. I was one party. Gwen. Her voice was warm, familiar. The voice I had known from book club and birthday dinners and Tuesday morning texts about nothing in particular for 12 years. I need you to understand. I never meant to hurt you. Mark and I, it just happened. I know that doesn't make it, Robin. I watched a woman on the level above me load groceries into her trunk, methodical bag by bag. Did you love him? Silence. 4 seconds, maybe 5. Long enough. Gwen, I just needed to get out of my marriage. Answer the question. More silence. Then carefully, I was never in love with him. I just needed somewhere to land while I figured things out. I know how that sounds. I just needed, okay, I said. That's enough. I ended the call. I stopped the recording and looked at the file. 4 minutes and 12 seconds. I put my phone in my bag and sat there for a minute, listening to the concrete sounds of the parking structure, the distant squeal of tires on another level, the hum of the ventilation system. 12 years. She had needed somewhere to land. I had apparently been part of the landscape she was navigating around. I drove home. I taught my 8 o'clock class the next morning and did not think about Robin or Mark for the full 75 minutes, which was the first time since the Tuesday of the group chat that I had managed that. Emily Dickinson helped. She generally does. Patricia Drummond's office was on the 2nd floor of a building on 2nd Avenue with a waiting room that had 2 chairs and no magazines, which I appreciated. Her door had a frosted glass panel. She opened it herself at exactly 2 o'clock. No family photos on her desk. A Georgia State Bar certificate in a plain black frame on the wall. One small cactus on the windowsill, the kind that required almost nothing and outlasted everything. She was 60 or close to it, with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the settled expression of someone who had heard most things and was not easily surprised by the rest. I handed her the USB drive. She plugged it in and began reading. 8 minutes passed. The clock on her wall was loud in the way that clocks in quiet offices always are. Outside the window, the Columbus courthouse sat in the October light, its columns very white. Somewhere down the block, someone was doing construction. Patricia pulled her glasses down and looked at me over the rims. Georgia fault divorce, she said. Adultery is an absolute bar to alimony if the supporting spouse is the one who committed it. Mark earns significantly more than you, about 3 times. Then, under state law, the court would be required to consider alimony in your favor. Equitable distribution allows the judge latitude when there's been marital misconduct, and $67,000 drawn from a joint account without consent is dissipation. That's a documented claim. She set her glasses on the desk. You have what you need. It should have felt larger than it did. 6 words, you have what you need, and I had expected them to land somewhere significant to rearrange something. Instead, I sat there in the chair across from Patricia's desk and felt mostly tired. The particular tiredness of having been right about something you didn't want to be right about for a very long time. Then my phone rang. An unfamiliar number. I let it go. 30 seconds later, the voicemail notification appeared and I played it on speaker because Patricia was already looking at me with an expression that said she had seen this before. A man's voice, smooth, measured. Mrs. Marsh, this is David Coulter calling on behalf of Mark Marsh. Mr. Marsh would like to explore a private settlement before any formal filings. He believes there's an outcome here that works well for both parties and would appreciate the chance to discuss it at your earliest convenience. I set the phone down on Patricia's desk. Today was day 11. The Whitmore Gala was day 22. 11 days. You want me to call him back, Patricia said. I picked up the phone. Let me think about it. But walking out of the building, down the stairs through the glass doors onto 2nd Avenue with the October air coming in cold off the Chattahoochee, I was not thinking about the settlement. I was thinking about Phil saying in his flat, unhurried way, when you decide, call me. Mark had heard I had a lawyer, and his first move was to offer me a deal. Not because he was afraid of the law, because he had 24 years of data that said I would take the deal, that I would stand at the kitchen window and drink cold coffee and file things away and eventually accept whatever terms were available rather than fight for different ones. He had very good data. The question was whether the data was still accurate. I walked to my car, got in, sat for a moment with the key in my hand before starting the engine. 11 days. I called Phil. Mark came home early on the 12th night. I knew something was different before I saw him. His car was in the driveway when I pulled in at 6, which hadn't happened on a weekday in longer than I could remember. I sat in my car for a moment, engine off, looking at the house. The kitchen light was on. The living room was dark. He was at the dining table when I came in. No laptop. No phone visible. Just Mark sitting with his hands folded on the table, wearing the patient expression of a man who had decided this was a negotiation and had arrived prepared. I set my bag down and sat across from him. I didn't get water. I didn't offer him anything. I waited. "I know you talked to an attorney," he said. "Yes. I think before this goes any further, we should consider what we actually want here. What we actually want. As though we had shared a want for some time and were now just clarifying the terms." "What does the offer look like?" I said. He outlined it carefully. The house would stay in my name. He would continue the mortgage payments for 3 years. He used the phrase generous support twice and the phrase handle this privately once, and by the time he was done, I understood exactly what he was and was not offering. No court filings, no public record, no fault-finding. He would announce his city council candidacy at the Whitmore Gala on the 22nd, with a clean history and a separation that could be managed quietly. Whatever he paid me, he was buying that. "We can end this like adults," he said. "I don't think either of us wants a drawn-out legal process." "On whose terms?" "It's a fair offer, Gwen. Patricia will tell you that. Patricia works for me." Something shifted in his face. Not anger, more like a recalibration, the way a contractor adjusts a bid when the first number doesn't land. He looked at me for a moment with an expression I hadn't seen before, or hadn't let myself see, which was the expression of a man who had significantly underestimated the amount of resistance in the room. "Gwen," his voice dropped, gentled, the tone he used when he wanted something from me. "You're not the kind of person who does this. You know that." I looked at him across the table. Our dining table, bought in 2003 at an estate sale in LaGrange, refinished by me over a weekend in the garage with 2 different stains before I found the right color. He had said it looked good. I couldn't remember now whether he'd said anything else. "You don't know what kind of person I am," I said. I stood up, took my bag, and went to bed. Not dramatically. I didn't slam any doors. There was no version of that night that required doors to slam. I just went to bed and lay in the dark for a long time, listening to him move around downstairs, and thought about the phrase, "the kind of person who does this." I had heard that phrase before, in different configurations from different people across a long stretch of years. You're not the kind of person who makes waves. You're not the kind of person who holds grudges. You're not the kind of person who files a formal complaint, who turns down a fellowship, who asks for more than what's on the table. He had not invented that phrase. He had just used it because it had always worked before, and there was no particular reason from his vantage point to think it wouldn't work now. I called Phil the next morning and asked if we could meet. He suggested a coffee shop near his office, one of the smaller independents on Broadway, not the places we would have gone with our respective spouses. We arrived within 3 minutes of each other. He was already at a corner table when I walked in with a plain manila folder in front of him and a cup of black coffee he hadn't touched yet. "Robin told me she'd filed," he said, after we'd established the basics of who had ordered what. "She said she was going to name me as the aggressor. Emotional abuse. She'd been building that story for about 6 months. Is any of it true? No. Flat. No elaboration needed and none offered. Was it a real threat? It was a bluff. Robin doesn't like confrontation. She wanted me to back down and give her a favorable settlement without a fight. He opened the folder. I kept records. What Phil had inside that folder was not what I expected. It was not angry. It was not messy. It was the patient, systematic output of a man who had suspected something for a long time and had decided, rather than confront it, to simply document it. There were printouts of a text chain Robin had forwarded to him 3 weeks earlier, a chain in which she'd been trying to demonstrate her innocence by sharing selected messages. She had not understood or had forgotten that when you forward a text thread, the metadata comes with it. The original timestamps were intact. The full conversation history between Robin and Mark was visible in the header data if you knew where to look. Phil knew where to look. 17 months. Robin and Mark had been in contact for 17 months. The first messages were brief social, the kind of thing that could be explained 100 ways. By month 3, they were not. She was waiting, Phil said, for Mark to finish the campaign launch. Once he had the seat and the salary and the public profile, she was going to leave me and have somewhere stable to go. I looked at the timestamps. Mark had started building his campaign operation in the same month. The messages changed in character. He had needed someone visible at his side for community events, someone who communicated warmth and connectivity, who knew the right people and said the right things in the right rooms. She was a prop, I said, for the campaign image. Yes, and he was a vehicle for getting out of her marriage. Yes. I set the printout down. Did she know that's what it was? Phil picked up his coffee. I don't think either of them was honest with the other about what they wanted. I think that's probably how it could last 17 months without resolving into anything. You're the most methodical person I've ever met, I said. I'm a CPA. It's a professional hazard. I called Patricia from the parking lot of the coffee shop before I had even started the car. I want a file, I said. Fault grounds. Adultery. Before Friday. A pause. Gwen, once we file, there's an automatic temporary restraining order on assets. He won't be able to move anything. I know. Friday is the 22nd. I know what Friday is. Another pause, shorter. All right, Patricia said. I'll have the papers ready by Thursday. The Whisper campaign started on the 16th. I don't know exactly when Mark made the calls, or whether he made them himself, or had someone do it for him. The mechanism doesn't matter as much as the result. What I know is that on Tuesday, a student came to my office hours with a question about a quiz grade, a quiz on which she had earned the score in the gradebook, a score she had not previously questioned. She was apologetic. She said someone had suggested to her that grades this semester might not have been recorded accurately, given everything going on. I told her the grade was correct, and she could confirm it in the portal. She thanked me and left, and I sat at my desk for a moment after the door closed and understood what had happened. That evening, I went to the faculty lounge to refill my water bottle, which I did at approximately 5 o'clock every day, a habit so established it had become invisible. 2 colleagues were talking by the coffee machine. They stopped when I walked in. Not dramatically. Just a natural pause, the kind that happens when a conversation reaches a stopping point. Except that this one happened in the middle of a sentence, and neither of them quite met my eyes after. I refilled my water bottle. I went back to my office. Della came to find me the next morning. She closed my office door and sat down and said without preamble, "Someone called Martin. Martin was the department chair, told him you were having a breakdown following a personal crisis, and recommended he suggest a leave of absence." I was looking at the window. Outside students were crossing the quad in both directions, backpacks and coffee cups, the ordinary machinery of a university morning. "The complaint to academic affairs," I said. "The student who came in about her grade." "Part of it, yes." "He didn't go after the evidence," I said. "It came out quieter than I expected. He went after the place." Della said nothing. She didn't need to. The one room where I had never surrendered anything, where I knew what I was doing and why, where my judgment had been tested and confirmed across 30 years of students and colleagues and institutional reviews, where if someone looked at the record, they would find nothing but competence and care and a woman who showed up. And now someone was suggesting to the people who knew me in this room that my judgment could not be trusted, that my perception of reality had been compromised by a personal situation, that the responsible thing, the concerned and compassionate thing, would be to recommend I step back, the careful, anonymous shape of it. No accusation anyone could answer directly. Just a question planted in the air. Is she okay? I called Patricia that afternoon from my car in the faculty parking lot, still warm from the engine. He's going after my reputation at the university, I said. Can you document it? Not yet. Then we don't have enough on that front right now. She paused. Is there anything else? I looked at the windshield. A ginkgo leaf had settled against the glass, bright yellow, the kind of specific October yellow that lasts about 4 days before it turns. I'm starting to second-guess myself, I said. I know, Patricia said. That's the point. She said it the same way she said everything level, and without surprise. And somehow that was the thing that kept me from falling all the way into it. Not reassurance, not comfort. Just, I know. That's the point. As though the mechanism were simply a mechanism, something that could be identified and named, and therefore not mistaken for truth. On the 19th, I stayed in my office until 9 o'clock at night. Not because I had anything that required my presence there that late, because the house had become a place I was only able to be in for the minimum necessary time, and the office was still mine in a way the house no longer felt like it was. I had moved some things to the campus office in small increments over the past week, without quite deciding to. A second set of reading glasses. A cardigan I liked. The USB drive in the bottom drawer. My desk lamp made a yellow circle on the papers in front of me. The building was mostly empty and settling into itself the way old academic buildings do at night. Small sounds from pipes and ductwork, the creak of the floor in the hallway outside as the temperature dropped. Through the window, the campus was dark, except for the path lights and a few illuminated windows in the library across the quad. I had not come to grade. I had come to sit somewhere that was mine and try to think clearly. I picked up a stack of essays from that week's class, not to assess them, just to read. There is something clarifying about reading student writing when you are trying to get out of your own head. They are working things out on the page in real time, and sometimes the thing they are working out turns out to be something you needed to hear. One paper on the awakening, Edna stops performing for the people around her because at some point she decides her own experience is worth believing even if no one else confirms it. Another paper from a student writing on Gilman. The women in these stories are punished for knowing too much, but they are punished more for pretending not to know. I set that one down. 24 years. I had not been a passive victim of 24 years. That would have been in some ways easier, simpler to account for. What I had been was a participant, not in the affair, not in the deception, but in the architecture of my own diminishment. I had filed things away. I had accepted the terms of the kitchen window and the cold coffee and the check I didn't ask about. I had translated every red flag into a language that meant something less alarming because it was easier to live in a story where I was fine than in one where I was not. The fellowship. 2001. I had wanted that fellowship badly enough that I had practiced how to tell my advisor I was accepting it. I had the speech ready, and then Mark had gotten the contract and said Columbus made sense, and I had put the speech away and I had called that love. Surrender is a decision. I had made it. Many times. Not because I was weak exactly, but because the cost of each individual surrender had seemed manageable, and the accumulated cost had not been visible from inside the day-to-day of it. But the decision in front of me now was also a decision. And I was 52 years old and my name was Gwen Marsh, and I had spent 3 decades teaching people to pay attention to what the text actually said rather than what they wished it said. I opened my laptop and wrote an email to Phil. I'm ready. You said you had something I needed to see. Can we meet tomorrow? I sent it before I could revise it. Then I turned off the desk lamp and sat for a moment in the dark before getting up. Through the window, the pathlights made small pools on the wet grass. 3 days until the gala. I picked up Deja's essay from the desk and read the sentence one more time in the light from the window. The women in these stories always know before they know. Then I put it in my bag and went home. Phil's office was on the 4th floor of a building on Macon Road, a CPA firm he'd been with for 12 years. I'd driven past it dozens of times, going to and from other things, and never once registered it as a place where a person I knew spent 40 hours a week. That's probably accurate, I thought, pulling into the parking lot on the 20th morning. You don't see the buildings that have nothing to do with you yet. The waiting room had a water cooler and 3 chairs and a framed print of the Georgia State Capitol that looked like it had been there since the building opened. His assistant showed me in without much ceremony. His desk was clear except for a yellow legal pad, a calculator I suspected he never actually used, and a folder, not a laptop open to some maximized spreadsheet. Just the folder set squarely in the center. The opposite of Mark's home office, which had always looked like important things, were happening just beyond the edge of what you could see. Phil opened the folder. October of last year, he said. Robin forwarded me a text thread. She was trying to establish that nothing inappropriate had occurred. She wanted me to see certain messages. He turned the printout toward me. She didn't know that forwarding a thread preserves the original metadata. The timestamps from her phone came with it. The full conversation history came with it. I looked at the dates. The first entries were from 17 months earlier. Late spring. A time I associated now, placing it against the calendar in my head, with Mark coming home energized about something he described only vaguely as some new connections. He'd started going to the gym again that month. I had thought it was about the campaign. It was about the campaign. Just not in the way I'd thought. She was helping him build the image, I said. Community presence, the right rooms, the right events. She knew the donor network from her design clients. He needed visibility with exactly those people. Phil's voice was the same as it always was, the voice of someone reporting findings. She was useful to him. He was useful to her. She wanted a clean exit from our marriage and someone to exit toward. They were using each other. Yes. And I was the cover, the stable background, the wife at home. He paused. The person whose presence made him look like a family man. I sat with that for a moment. The water cooler in the waiting room made a burbling sound through the closed door. Outside the window, Macon Road went about its ordinary business, cars and traffic lights, a woman walking a dog, past the parking lot entrance. 24 years of being the stable background. I picked up my phone and called Patricia. She answered on the second ring. I want to file, I said. Fault grounds. Adultery. I need it done before Friday. A brief pause. Once we file, the automatic temporary restraining order activates. He won't be able to transfer or liquidate any marital assets. I know. Friday is the Whitmore Gala. I know what Friday is. Phil was looking at a point somewhere past my left shoulder, not listening in any pointed way, just giving me the room the call required. Patricia said she'd have the papers ready by Thursday afternoon. I thanked her and ended the call. Done, Phil said. Done. He closed the folder and slid it across the desk to me. Keep it. Patricia may want the metadata printout. I put it in my bag next to Deja's essay, which I'd been carrying around for 3 days without fully deciding why. Phil stood and we shook hands, which felt formal and exactly right. We were not friends. We were 2 people who had been handed the same problem from opposite sides and had briefly needed each other to solve it. What will you do? I said at the door. Go back to work. He said it without irony. Robin will contest the filing. It'll take a while, but I have records. He always had records. I drove home. Patricia called Thursday at 4:30 to confirm it was done. The filing was in the system. Mark Marsh respondent adultery grounds Georgia fault divorce. Public record as of 4:30 that afternoon. I was sitting at the kitchen table when she called, which was something I had not done in 3 weeks without a specific reason to be there. I had been avoiding the kitchen. Now I sat at it and looked at the window over the sink, the window I had stood at on Tuesday mornings with a cold cup of coffee and something I didn't want to look at directly. "Thank you," I said. "See you on the other side," Patricia said, which was not the kind of thing I had expected from her, but it sounded right. The Whitmore Gala was held every October at the Columbus Convention Center in the large ballroom on the second floor, with the chandeliers that were older than the building's current management. It was the kind of event that attracted city council members, developers, the editors of the local paper, the chairs of various community organizations, and a category of person I had always privately thought of as professional attendees. People whose primary skill was showing up to the right rooms at the right time. Mark was very good at it, better than I had ever been. I wore the blue dress I wore to faculty events. It was not new. It was not particularly notable. It was the dress of a woman who had come to attend a function not to be looked at, and I had chosen it for exactly that reason. He was near the center of the room when I arrived in a new navy suit, talking to 3 men from the City Planning Commission. He looked like a man whose evening was going well. He had the posture of someone who expected the next 2 hours to go a specific way, and the way they were going to go was good. The ballroom smelled of cut flowers and something expensive from the catering stations along the south wall. A jazz quartet in the corner was playing something I recognized but couldn't name. The glassware caught the chandelier light in small bright points. It was a beautiful room, genuinely the kind of room that made Columbus look like a city that had figured something out. At 8:47, Mark moved toward the small stage, where the microphone was set up. He never reached it. Tom Aldridge, who chaired the campaign finance committee for the district, looked at his phone first. Then Linda Park, who edited the Columbus Ledger-Inquirer. She had told me once years ago at a dinner party that she kept alerts set for public filings with names she tracked. I had not remembered that conversation until Thursday afternoon, filing it away, mentally alongside a note to tell Patricia. 3 other phones lit up within 90 seconds. I watched the small adjustments, the slight reorientations, the way a room registers information without anyone saying anything aloud. Aldridge took 2 steps back from where he'd been standing. One of the planning commission men checked his own screen. A space appeared around Mark that hadn't been there a moment before. Not large, not dramatic, just the small, natural movement of people recalibrating. Mark saw me then. He looked across the room and found my face, and whatever he'd been about to say into the microphone he did not say. He came to me instead. He moved through the room with the same smoothness. He'd always had the same ability to look purposeful, without looking hurried, but something in it was different. He was managing a situation rather than leading one, and somewhere behind his eyes he knew it. "You did this here," he said quietly. "Not a question. I filed a legal document. I came to a gala I was already planning to attend. Patricia filed at 4:30 today. You knew what that would affect your image." "Yes." I looked at him steadily. "I knew." He was quiet for a moment. The jazz quartet moved into something slower. Someone near the bar laughed at something, a clear, bright sound that belonged to a different conversation entirely. "I didn't think you'd do this," he said. And there it was again for the last time. "I didn't think you were the kind of person." "I know you didn't," I said. Tom Aldridge appeared at Mark's elbow. "Mark, could I steal you for a minute?" The voice of someone drawing distance politely. The voice of someone who had revised his assessment of how the evening should go. I watched Mark turn toward Aldridge, with the full equipment of his social manner engaged, watched him begin to manage the next thing. He was not finished. He had resources and lawyers and a network that would help him shape whatever story came next. I was not under any illusions about that. But the announcement he had planned to make tonight would not happen tonight. The clean record he had tried to buy from me 2 weeks ago at our dining table did not exist anymore. And there was a court filing in the public record that described in the flat legal language of a Georgia fault divorce petition exactly what had occurred in our marriage. That was what he had been trying to prevent. Not the divorce, the record. I set my glass down on a passing tray and collected my coat from the coat check and walked out through the lobby and into the October night. The parking lot was quiet. My car was where I'd left it, 3rd row, halfway down. The air had the particular sharpness of Georgia in late October, cold enough to be real, but not yet cold enough to be hard. Above the parking lot lights, the sky was clear. My phone showed one message from Phil. One word, done. He had served Robin the papers that evening. I stood by my car for a moment without getting in. I want to be honest about what I felt because I have been trying to be honest throughout this, and the honest answer is that it was not what I would have predicted on the night of the group chat when I had been so much angrier. It was quieter than anger, more tired than triumphant. There was something in it that I didn't have a clean word for the particular weight of a long effort coming to its natural end. Not relief, exactly. Not satisfaction, exactly. Something that lived between those things and carried a little grief in it too, the way most honest endings do. I had been married for 24 years to a man who had looked at me across a dining table and tried to purchase my silence. And I had come close, very close to letting him. I had a long history of letting people purchase my silence in smaller denominations, and he had simply been the largest transaction. I got in the car and drove home. Robin called twice the next day. I watched her name on the screen and set the phone face down and went back to reading. 2 days later, she sent a text. Phil served me. He has the records, the file with Mark. I didn't know he was recording. I need to talk to you. I read it. Then a day after that, a long message. She was sorry. She wanted me to understand the position she had been in. She thought I, of all people, would understand how complicated a marriage could become, how sometimes a person made decisions that they knew weren't right, but that felt like the only available exit. She thought I had always been the person in her life who could hold two things at once. She hoped I could hold this. I read that one too. Read it twice because there were 12 years in it, and 12 years is not nothing, and I was not going to pretend it was nothing just because the end of it was what it was. I typed 2 responses and deleted them both. The first was too much. The second was also too much. The third, which I kept, was 4 words. I understand. That's not enough. I blocked her number. 3 weeks after the gala, I was standing in front of 19 students in a classroom that smelled like dry erase marker and someone's travel coffee mug. And I had written 2 words on the board: control and surrender. We've spent a semester with women who had to figure out the relationship between those 2 things, I said. What I want to ask today is whether they're actually opposites. Deja Campbell was in the second row. She was graduating in 3 weeks. She had written the best paper I'd received in the 5 years I'd been teaching that particular course, and she had written it without fully knowing, I think, what she was actually saying. The class talked. I listened. Not in the way I sometimes listen to class discussions with part of my attention on the time or the next point or whether the pacing was right. I listened the way you listen when you have no agenda other than to hear what people think. It had been a while since I had been able to do that. After class, Deja waited until the other students had filtered out. She was holding the essay I'd returned to her, the one I'd kept in my desk drawer for a year and a half. You held on to this, she said. Not a question, not quite. It was the best sentence in the class that year. She looked at the paper. I wrote that, and I didn't know why it was true. I just knew it was true. That's usually how the right sentences arrive. She turned the paper over. Do you know now why it's true I thought about the kitchen window? The check in the filing. The 11 o'clock phone call from the porch that I had chosen not to hear. About being 52 years old and standing in a parking lot on an October night and understanding finally the difference between not knowing and choosing not to know. Yes, I said. I think I do. After she left, I sat at my desk for a while in the morning, quiet. The campus outside was ordinary students and bicycles and the maintenance crew running a leaf blower somewhere in the middle distance. On my desk, Deja's essay sat where I'd put it when I returned it, not in the drawer anymore. Not a thing I was keeping in case I needed to be reminded. Just a piece of writing I admired by a person who was about to go make her way in the world. I opened my laptop. In the inbox between a note from the registrar and a message from a graduate student was an email from the University of Georgia. Visiting lecturer program. Spring semester. One position in the American Literature Division applications due in November. The fellowship I had not taken in 2001 was a different program at a different school, and I was 52 years old rather than 28, and none of that was reversible. 24 years are 24 years. The woman who had stood at the kitchen window with cold coffee was a real woman who had made real choices, and I was not going to rewrite her as someone simpler or weaker than she was. But I was also this woman, the one sitting at this desk in an office that smelled like old books in October, with a legal filing in the public record and a class that had just talked for 50 minutes about the difference between surrender and choice. I opened the email from the University of Georgia and started to read. I did not close it. If any part of Gwen's story felt familiar, that recognition is worth sitting with. Not the specific details, maybe, but the habit of filing things away. The cold coffee you drank anyway. The question you didn't ask because asking would mean you already knew the answer and you weren't ready to know it yet. The moment someone told you that you weren't the kind of person who did something, and part of you believed them not because they were right, but because you'd been told some version of that your whole life from enough direction that it had started to feel like fact. What Gwen learned wasn't that she needed to fight harder or speak louder or catch her husband sooner. What she learned was that she had been making decisions all along, every time she stood at that window and chose not to ask. Every time she called it keeping the peace, or being reasonable, or not making a big deal out of nothing. Those were decisions. Quiet ones made in ordinary kitchens on ordinary mornings, but decisions nonetheless. And once she understood that she also understood something harder, the next thing was a decision too. She didn't need Mark to confess. She didn't need Robin to apologize. She didn't need anyone's permission to trust what she already knew. That's the part that stays with me. Not the filing, not the gala, not the fellowship email at the end. The moment in a dark office at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night alone with a stack of student essays, when she stopped waiting for someone else to confirm what she'd already seen. Have you ever known something before you let yourself know it? Have you ever looked back at a moment and thought, I was standing right there, and I chose not to look? If this story moved, you leave a comment below. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.